one of the main controversies about the Reconstruction of the South is whether or not African Americans had rights during this time period. There is tons of evidence from articles that shows they were still not truly treated like real human beings from 1865 to 1877, which was directly after the American Civil War. An article titled "The Law and Politics" by Charles Reagan Wilson states that Mississippi passed the Black Codes in 1865 mainly to control a newly fluid black labor force. Under these codes, blacks still seemed to be an inferior type of people. Wilson, who was a chair of history and professor of Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi, said, "They granted rights of blacks to hold personal property, intermarry, sue in state courts, swear out criminal warrants, and testify against whites under certain conditions. The right to vote, however, was not yet given to them." F. Michael Higginbotham, former dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law, is the author of the second article. She explains the problems freed slaves had with starting their new lives by saying, "The Civil War may have ended a formal slavery, but it also set in motion a new racial schism of white superiority and black separation. This all began in 1865 as the Black Codes were also being created." The third article is titled "Black Policy During Reconstruction." Luis Alejandro Daniela Borrego, the author, graduated from Dartmouth College in 2007, where he majored in history and minored in theater. He received his MA in history from the University of Virginia in 2008. This article discusses how a black man had been hung in Alachua County, which happened to be home of Josiah Walsh. He was one of the first African Americans elected during the Reconstruction Era. Lynchings like these were a method of social and racial control meant to terrorize black American citizens into fear and then submission. They would put blacks to death by tying a noose around their neck and hanging them from a tree. They became very widely practiced in the United States by whites from 1877 to 1950. Ronald S. Lewis and Philip S. Foner created the next article, known as "The Black Worker," to describe how newly freed people found it hard to survive on their own without a slave owner. The text states, "Even though blacks were overjoyed by the destruction of the institution of slavery, freedom brought unparalleled problems as well. Throughout the South, blacks suffered from inadequate food, housing, and other vital necessities." In an article labeled "Contract Labor in Florida," Edward K. Eckert says, "In the Gainesville area, government officials visited plantations and urged the freedmen to stay with their old masters in order to secure a certain living. The problems they were facing forced some African Americans into re-entering the slave world. These former slaves continued to work and live on the land of their former owners because it was an economic necessity to them. However, they were now technically free to come and go as they pleased. They were also now getting paid for their labor. This was the route most freed slaves took, while others were able to purchase land and gain a true sense of independence for themselves." Michael A. Ross wrote the sixth article and named it "The Journal of Southern History." In 1873, multiple court cases led to the Slaughterhouse decision. It stated that the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution only protects the legal rights that are associated with federal citizenship, not those that pertain to state citizenship. As a result, Ross said, "The only thing slaughtered in the Slaughterhouse Cases was the right of the Negro to equality." Though the decision in the Slaughterhouse Cases minimized the impact of the Privileges or Immunities Clause, the Supreme Court would later strike down state laws on the basis of other clauses in the 14th Amendment, including the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause. Going back to the Black Codes from the first article, the main reason for them was to force blacks into certain working conditions. In an article titled "Florida Black Codes," Joe M. Richardson said, "This desire for unpaid or poorly paid labor was widespread in Florida." Article 8 was written by Cal M. Logue. He named it "Racist Reporting During Reconstruction." It states that the press poked fun at blacks because they reacted to convention decisions on the basis of their own past experience. Even news reporters were bullying the colored people. On January 28th of 1868, a newspaper where blacks were being made fun of was released. Newspaper articles like these were made from 1865 to 1920 to cover the racial attitudes of local whites towards the black community. In an article known as the Ex-Slave Narratives, Horace D. Nast says, at the end of the war, ex-slaves immigrated to Arkansas by trainloads, boatloads, or wagon loads. Some even immigrated by walking the entire distance. Most of these immigrants went to Arkansas to farm. These people were forced to move locations to obtain affordable shelter and land. The draft riots of the 1860s contributed to further declines in the African American population as these families moved either to outer boroughs or left the city entirely to avoid anti-black violence. Lafayette County is part of Kansas City. The 1860 population included 4,146 whites and only 7 free colored people. By the 1870 census, the white population had decreased about 4% to 3,981, while the colored population increased over 19% to 5,158. As discussed before, whites terrorized and were violent towards newly freed colored people. In the final article, the author says, following the Civil War, Southern whites used violence and intimidation to reestablish their economic, political, and social dominance over the recently freed black population. The author of this article, which is called Between Equal Justice and Racial Terror, is Mark Leon DeVries. He is a doctor of philosophy and an e-learning specialist. Blacks were not actually free during the Reconstruction of the South that followed the American Civil War. It was not until March 30th of 1870 that the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. This finally gave all male citizens the right to vote.